Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Chris James. Tonight we're going to be talking about a few things that you probably never learned in school. Today is October 14th, 2017. This is show number 76. We just finished with the Texas Bigfoot Research Center's conference up in Jefferson, Texas, but it's going to take me a while to decipher my own handwriting so I can put it into a show that's both entertaining and informative. So instead of talking about the show, we'll be talking about things you should have learned in school but didn't. Before we get to talking about these things, I'd like to invite anyone listening to the Book Warehouse, 1600 Water Street in Laredo, October 28th at 5 p.m. We'll be having a book signing and a meet and greet. Hopefully some of the guys from the Laredo Paranormal Research Society will manage to show up and they'll be there with me. I'll be signing copies of the LPRS book I wrote a few years ago, and maybe a few of the others I've got out. Napoleon was born on 15th of August, 1769, at Carlo Marie de Bonaparte and Marie Letizia Romolino in his family's ancestral home, Casa Bonaparte in Ajaccio, the capital of the island of Corsica. He was their fourth child, and he was the third son. This was a year after the island had been transferred to France by the Republic of Genoa. He was Christian Napoleone de Bonaparte, probably named after an uncle of his. In his 20s, he adopted a more French-sounding name of Napoleon Bonaparte. The Corsican Bonapartes were descended from a minor Italian nobility of Tuscan origin who had come to Corsica from Liguria in the 16th century. Napoleon was 5'7". Now, people always liked to say he was a little short guy. At the time, measurements were taken using different units. When converted to modern inches and feet, Napoleon would have been only 5'3". Somebody had screwed up. They took another look at the conversion chart and they found that he was actually 5'7". Alexander the Great was 5'7" as well, and nobody called him short. Some folks will tell you that mimes came about when Napoleon passed the law against comedians because they kept making fun of him. This was supposed to lead to the creation of mimes. Actually, mimes began in ancient Greece at the theater of Dionysus in Athens. Actors wore masks and performed on an outdoor stage. Audiences would run up to 10,000 or more. This was the festival to honor the god of theater, Dionysus. When the Romans conquered Greece, they took mime back to Italy and found ways to make it their own. This is when comedy and tragedy first developed. Mime continued to grow throughout the Middle Ages. In Italy, during the early 1500s, Commedia dell'arte emerged. Acrobatic street performers would wear masks with exaggerated comical features. This was to draw attention to the performers. The characters they created became known as zany. In 1576, a company of Italian mime led by Flamminio Scala traveled to France, where mime became extremely popular. This was 113 years before Napoleon was born. Those horrible striped shirts they wear came out of the French Navy. In 1920, when Coco Chanel took the Navy shirt and made it popular. Napoleon was trained as an artillery officer in 1789 during the French Revolution. He saw the writing on the wall, and he threw in with the revolutionaries. As soon as the revolution had come to a close, he began to climb the ladder until he seized power and became the dictator of all of France. Bonaparte wanted more than just France. He began to invade neighboring countries, using speed and unexpected movements to overpower the opposition. France was one of the few countries to have a full-time army. France's naval power was not yet strong enough to confront the British Royal Navy, so Napoleon decided to try going around them. He sent the military expedition to seize Egypt and thereby undermine Britain's access to its trade interests in India. Bonaparte wanted to establish a French presence in the Middle East. He intended to link up with Tipu Sultan, a Muslim enemy of the British who was in India at the time. Napoleon told the people of France he was going to free Jerusalem from the Muslims. He was good at playing both sides against each other. Napoleon assured the Directory of France that as soon as he had conquered Egypt, he would be able to establish relations with the Indian princes. Once this had been accomplished, the two powers would work together in order to attack the English who were ruling India at the time. May 1798, Bonaparte was elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences. He would take 167 scientists with him to Egypt. The expedition would include mathematicians, naturalists, chemists, and geodesists. Bonaparte moved towards Egypt by way of Malta, which was controlled by the Knights Hospitaller. On June 9, 1798, Grand Master Ferdinand von Hopsich zu Belhem surrendered after token resistance. They didn't want to just throw up their arms and surrender. Bonaparte captured this important naval base with the loss of 3 men. General Bonaparte and his expedition eluded the Royal Navy and landed in Alexandria in July 1st, 1798. Napoleon's army fought the Battle of Shubra Kait against the Mamluks, Egypt's ruling military caste. The Mamluks were a class of warrior slaves, mostly Turkish and Caucasian ethnicity, who served between the 9th and the 19th century in the Islamic world. Despite starting out as slaves, the Mamluks often had higher social standing than freeborn people. The victory helped the French practice their defensive tactics for the Battle of the Pyramids, which was fought on July 21st, which never actually got close to the pyramids. The battle actually took place about 15 miles away. The two sides were equal in size, but the French had the advantage of modern equipment, and they were fresh from several victories. Each side had about 25,000 men in the field. The Mamluks lost about 2,000 men, whereas the French only lost 29. With every victory, the morale of the French army would increase. We're going to take a little pause right here, drink some coffee, and play a couple of commercials. Don't go away. We'll be right back. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio.
Are
Do you
you?
have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James. independent beauty consultant and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. I have no idea why that keeps happening. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If your vision isn't what it used to be, and you're not sure you're seeing Bigfoot or just your neighbor mowing his lawn, stop on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, just across the street from the Embassy Suites. You should be able to see what you're looking at. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Yep, I definitely seem to have some gremlins in the studio tonight. On August 1st, 1798, the British fleet under Horatio Nelson captured or destroyed all but 2 French vessels in the Battle of the Nile. Napoleon was left without a navy. He was able to increase the French presence in Egypt. The locals did everything in their power to make life hard on the army. One of the most important byproducts of the French invasion of Egypt was the wealth of knowledge gathered by the team of scientists and historians who'd traveled with the army. Of all the discoveries made, the most important was the Rosetta Stone, the key that unlocked the ancient marvels of Egypt. Hieroglyphics were meaningless to anybody trying to read them. They were just a bunch of symbols carved in stone. They didn't translate into letters or numbers, so there's no way of working out what was written, and all they could do is just look at the symbols and wonder. As Napoleon's army took possession of the town of Rosetta, they discovered a stone had been hidden inside one of the walls that was damaged at the fort of St. Julian. The stone had hieroglyphics as well as ancient Greek writing. The scholars with Napoleon could read ancient Greece, so they were able to figure out what the hieroglyphics said. Had the stone never been found, the modern world would never have figured out what was written on all those Egyptian walls and tablets. Had the Battle of St. Julian not knocked down one particular wall, the stone would never have been found. When the French finally surrendered Egypt to Britain in 1801, the British demanded that the Rosetta Stone be included in the treasures that were surrendered. The Rosetta Stone was taken to the British Museum on board the captured French frigate HMS Île-Égyptienne. Today, the Egyptian government keeps insisting that the stone should be returned to Egypt, but the British are being very British and ignoring these demands. Bonaparte began his retreat from the Middle East. He didn't have the facilities to take care of the sick and the wounded, so many of them were simply poisoned. No one knows how many were killed by their own side. His troops also killed any and all prisoners of war. Once back in France, Napoleon announced that he had been to Jerusalem and he'd freed the city from the Muslims. The people of Paris were ecstatic. Nobody ever bothered to go and check to find out if he'd ever actually been to Jerusalem, which he hadn't. Napoleon wanted to be able to communicate with his forces in the field at night. It was near impossible to read any messages at night without a bright enough light source that would also give away your location. Reading any message at night using a flickering candle while crouching behind cover just wasn't working. Napoleon told his officers to come up with a solution and do it right now. A man named Charles Barbier came up with a system of communication using holes punched into a piece of paper. This was called night writing. The message could be felt using the fingertips. The system worked out well in the back rooms of Paris, where the inventor worked, but once the officers in the field were handed these messages, nobody could decipher them. You can't just run your fingers over a piece of paper and feel the code of these holes. The system was abandoned by the military. Barbier managed to get his night writing system into the hands of some people who were more than happy to put in the time and effort to learn how to decipher these messages. The night writing became known as Braille. This is the reading and writing system used by the blind today. 1808, Napoleon was about to control all of Europe. His army was moving through Italy. When they reached the Vatican, Napoleon demanded Pope Pius VII surrender the Vatican to the French emperor. After all, Napoleon was Catholic. Pope Pius responded by excommunicating Napoleon. Well, Napoleon had Pope Pius arrested. He was hauled off to Paris along with what was known as the secret archives. Hundreds of thousands of documents were loaded into wagons and hauled away to Paris. Every book they could get their hands on was dropped into boxes and trunks and sent north. Nobody bothered to keep anything in any kind of an order. A few, if any, of the soldiers tasked with moving all these papers could read or write, so to them this was just unnecessary weight to be dealt with, and in the quickest, easiest means possible. Everything was just piled together in boxes and crates. Rare documents mixed in with letters written by Michelangelo. Maps, hand-drawn by Columbus, were stuffed into chests with letters about the weather in Constantinople. When Napoleon's army began to crumble in 1815, the archives were just thrown into warehouses in Paris. The cost of returning everything back to the Vatican was extraordinary. So, to save time and money, the cardinal, who was put in charge of the archives, burned some of them, and he sold other valuable documents to anybody that wanted them. Some ancient documents were used to wrap up trinkets sold at shops. Others were used to wrap food items like bread and fish. We're talking tons of valuable documents and books that we'll never see again. Once they had enough money to return the archives to Rome, the boxes and crates were all piled into wagons once more and dragged back south. It took months of travel. Once back in the Vatican, everything was just pushed into the library. It was then necessary to open each and every box and start sorting the contents. The sorting is still going on today. Incredible finds happen all the time as letters and documents are found written by scholars and leaders from the past. During his reign, Napoleon wanted a better way of measuring. The feet and inches were being used by just about everyone, but he wanted something else, something he considered better. So Napoleon set about installing the metric system into France and all the countries he controlled. He's no longer with us, but his measuring system is still around. Napoleon said an army marched on their stomachs. If you were ever in the army, you'd know what this means. Each and every day in the army, you're guaranteed 3 things. 3 hots and a cot, and your mail if it ever catches up with you. What this means was you'd get fed 3 times a day. It might be MREs or it might be breakfast at 10 a.m., lunch at noon, and dinner at 4. That's your 3 meals. Soldiers work best when they have something in their stomachs. The cot was somewhere back in the rear, and you probably never used it, and mail call happened when it happened. As Napoleon's army was moving through Europe and the Middle East, they had to find food wherever it was. This was known as foraging. Civilians would call it stealing. Can you imagine? You march all day, then as the sun was going down, you had to run around in the dark looking for anything to turn into dinner. If you're lucky, you'd have enough for 1 or 2 meals. Napoleon wanted some form of provision that could be carried along with the army and distributed each evening without running the risk of food poisoning. You would win few battles if your entire army was sick. The inventors of Paris and the countryside began experimenting with ways of cooking and preserving food that would be both edible and safe. During the first years of the Napoleonic War, the French government offered a hefty cash reward of 12,000 francs to any inventor who could devise a cheap and effective method of preserving large amounts of food. This was an entire year's wage if you were a skilled laborer. The larger armies of the period required increased and regular supplies of food. Marching a few hundred people through the countryside was one thing, but thousands of men would need a lot more supplies, and foraging just wouldn't work. Somebody was going to go hungry. Military campaigns only took place during the spring and summer months. By fall, it was time to head home and prepare for winter. In 1809, Nicolas Appert, a French confectioner and brewer, observed that food cooked inside a jar didn't spoil unless the seals leaked, and he developed a method of sealing food into glass jars. Appert was awarded the prize in 1810 by the court Montalvert, a French minister of the Interior. The reason for lack of spoilage was unknown at the time, since it would be another 50 years before Louis Pasteur demonstrated the role of microbes in food spoilage. The food was preserved in a can made out of tin. The process could be recreated by anybody at home. Food preserved this way was called canning. 1858, John L. Mason invented the modern canning jar and gave it his name, the Mason jar. He's the one that came up with the system of making that screw top that would go on a jar. Now food could be preserved in the same way, only using a glass jar. The process was mostly the same, so the name continued to be called canning, even though the food was going into a jar. Once the food was delivered to the troops, a new problem arose. How do you get the food out? Well, troops are good at breaking things. The can was a thing, and they got busy breaking it by hacking the tops off using bayonets or axes. Some would shoot holes through the can and dribble the contents out through the hole. It wasn't until 1858, almost a half a century after the can was invented, when Ezra Warren patented the first can opener. The P-38 was a military can opener developed in 1942. Nobody knows why it was called the P-38, but the rumor has it that it took 38 twists of the handle to open a can of C rations. The P-51 is just a bigger version of the P-38. Just so you'll know, the C rations were any food you could eat in the field, whether it was heated up or not. B rations were food that had to be heated up before served in the field. A rations were served in the chow hall. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, The canning process was gradually employed in other European countries and in the United States. Back then, the uniforms were issued to troops, so during a battle you could look down on the field and tell who was who. Oddly enough, even with the uniforms all belonging to the same army, there were still a whole host of different styles. The cavalry had one uniform and the artillery had a different one. You had to be well acquainted with the entire army if you hoped to know who was on your side. Officers were all supposed to be gentlemen. They all came from families with money. They attended schools and they could read and write. Math was also necessary if you wanted to be an officer, especially in the artillery. Officers were expected to buy their own uniforms. Even today, officers have to buy their own clothes. The infantry was made up from lower-class folks. Most never went to school. They joined the army in order to earn money. Some were sent to the army to pay off debts. Some just wanted to get away from home. Their uniforms were provided by the government. The average soldier had one uniform, one pair of pants to last the whole year. Everything was made out of wool. And some of the troops had zero manners. Napoleon had observed his troops, mostly the infantry, doing something that made him uneasy and quite mad at the same time. He felt it wasn't showing respect to the army. During cold weather, the soldiers would wipe their noses using the sleeves of their uniforms. After a few weeks, there would be a crust on both sleeves. Napoleon asked his generals to make the men stop this practice. The soldiers, being soldiers, they would stop wiping snot on their uniforms only when the officers were around. Once the officers were out of sight, it was business as usual. You can tell when somebody's using their sleeves inappropriately. Well, some bright guy came up with a solution. The army began sewing buttons on the sleeves of all these foot soldiers' uniforms. The buttons would make wiping your nose painful. Well, today, look at a dress jacket. They all have buttons sewn on the sleeves. The more buttons, the more the garment costs. Napoleon was one of the greatest military leaders in the history of warfare. Without him, we might not have canned goods, Braille, the Rosetta Stone, metrics in Europe, and buttons on coat sleeves. And we're going to take a break here and play a couple of commercials. We'll be right back after these, so please don't go away. And it's not making any noise. Yo. Yep, Gremlins. Are you taking care of your skin? Or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. Coffee makes the world go round. And around here, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike, 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. If you're not looking for coffee, try their tea. It's the best in town. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. If you need to squint and hold things out at arm's length to see them, maybe you should get your eyes checked. Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, is right across from the Embassy Suites. Stop squinting and start seeing.
No, don't say goodbye. Stay with us. This is Arcanelza Radio. Quédate con nosotros. Estás escuchando Arcanelza Radio.
You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. Yep, I've definitely got gremlins in the studio. They're sitting on their cat tree looking at me right now. Every time they sneak up and push a button and then run and hide. Mostly they just like sitting on the computer keyboard and playing things they're not supposed to. Typical cats. And now back to the show. Way back, when our ancestors were sitting around caves listening to saber-toothed tigers sniffing around outside, they didn't have any of the nice things we have today. Things like coffee and computers and soft beds and coffee. When the call of nature hit, they had to go out behind a tree somewhere and take care of business. Should they have to do a number 2, or had they eaten some bad food and maybe had to do number 3. Number 3 is when you go number 1 where you should do number 2. If you don't understand, send me an email and I'll fill in the blanks for you. Right, back to the numbers. Once you finish doing your doodahs, you need to clean up. You had a choice, leaves or dirt. You scrubbed away and hoped you did a good job. If not, you'd run the risk of developing a rash and smelling up the cave, too. Things were bad enough since deodorant hadn't been invented for a few million years yet. Before it came along, you just had to put up with it. Plus, you now ran the risk of becoming sick from some nastiness that is spread by the lack of soap. As civilization advanced, the Phoenicians developed a device that was made from parchment and a piece of paste that, when used correctly, would show if a woman was pregnant or not. This was 3,000 years ago. They were one of the most advanced nations on Earth, but they didn't solve the bathroom problem. You still had to use your imagination once you were finished. In Rome, they had communal toilets. You'd go in and sit on one of the openings, and you could discuss politics or business while you were eliminating your waste. Once you're finished, you'd ask somebody to pass the brush. They had a stick with a piece of sponge tied to the end. If you had said something to upset the guy next to you, you'd get the wrong end of the stick. There were slaves underneath the floor. Their job was to flush for you. The word plumber came from the Roman Empire. The Latin word for lead is plumbum. Roman roofs used lead for their gutters to drain water away from the roofs. Lead was also used for piping and for making bathtubs. In medieval times, anyone who worked with lead was referred to as a plumber because they worked with plumbum. Water pipes were made from lead, and it did have a nasty effect on people's brains. But nobody knew that might happen back then. They're kind of like using aspartame today, except some of us are on to the side effects. In 1391, the first toilet paper was invented to be used by the Chinese emperor. As an extreme luxury item, only royalty had access to toilet paper. This made knowing the emperor a really good thing. The toilet paper came in a 2-foot by 3-foot sheet. You had to tear it, but there weren't any of those little dotted lines yet. The Bureau of Imperial Supplies produced 720,000 sheets of toilet tissue per year. That's about 2,000 sheets a year. You'd have to be high up in the royal court to get your hands on some royal toilet paper. I wonder if the guys making the stuff ever snuck some home. China exported a lot of things back then, but toilet paper wasn't on the list of exports. In the early 1500s, the King of England decided he was just too powerful or rich or something or other to take care of business on his own. He liked to have people around who could talk to him while he was sitting on the private throne. Yes, he had a bunch of guys standing around discussing business while he used the bathroom. Once he had finished, he had a servant called the Groom of the Stool, whose job it was to clean the king's backside. A male servant would scrub the royal derriere and thus make sure there were no royal skid marks. You'd think this was an icky job, but some folks considered it to be the highest honor, to be named the Groom of the Stool. If nothing else, you knew you would have the king's ear for at least a few minutes every day. Sir John Harington is often credited with creation of a device that led to the invention of today's flush toilet. This led to the throne being called the John. Thomas Crapper was a plumber who started the Thomas Crapper and Company in London. He was well known for the quality of his products. Manhole covers with Crapper's company name on them in Westminster Abbey are now one of London's minor tourist attractions. Thomas Crapper and Company owned the world's first bathroom, toilet, and sink showroom on King's Road until 1966. And yes, that's why it's called the Crapper. Brilliant men, but they both failed to come up with a solution for the final act of using the loo. Along comes the Sears and Roebuck Company. You could buy anything from them. If you wanted, you could order a house. They sold just about everything on earth, except toilet paper. However, their catalog, which started in 1896, was useful to finish up once you'd visited the latrine. You'd find the catalog sitting in either the outhouse, if you lived in the country, or right next to that fancy flush gadget you'd bought from Sears. Simply tear out a page and do what you had to do. The ink would wind up smeared about, but nobody thought this could be a bad thing until many years later. Unfortunately, the paper wasn't the right consistency to pass through the pipes unassisted. You had to call the plumber on a regular basis to come unclog things. In 1857, New Yorker Joseph Gaiety introduced the first packaged toilet tissue into the United States. The Gaiety firm, which was located in New Jersey, produced and sold a package of 500 sheets, selling for 50 cents a roll. It was called therapeutic paper and served as a medical paper as well as for cleaning up down below. It had a lot of rather large splinters embedded in the fabric. This led to a few painful encounters. The paper contained an abundance of aloe to help cure the sores. Joseph's name was printed on each and every sheet. In the Army, we'd have called the stuff John Wayne toilet paper. It was tough as all get out, and it didn't do a good job. Once more, you can email me, and I'll fill in any gaps. People were still using the Sears catalog to finish the paperwork. Then, along comes a bunch of brothers with a vision. 1874, Thomas, Irving, and Clarence Scott, all brothers, along with their cousins, Thomas Seymour and Zara Hoyt, established the Scott Paper Company in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They had come up with a kind of toilet paper that didn't have any splinters. It was soft and absorbent, and it had little perforated lines so you could tear it clean through. Unfortunately, people at the time didn't buy things like that. The shops would have toilet paper on display, but nobody would ask for a roll or two. It wasn't proper. Back then, you didn't walk up and down the aisles looking for things you needed that wouldn't happen for another 42 years. The first self-service grocery store was the Piggly Wiggly, which opened in 1916 in Memphis, Tennessee, by entrepreneur Clarence Sanders. The first shopping cart was invented by Sylvan Goldman from Oklahoma City in 1937. Nope, no one was willing to step up to the counter and say, "Give me a couple of rolls of that paper you used to clean your butt." It wasn't proper. Like it was proper to run around with ink all over your backside. The Scots were at a loss. How could something so much needed and useful be avoided in the stores? They just about went broke. Then someone had a brilliant idea. The brothers took toilet paper rolls to all of the big hotels in town. People got a chance to use the stuff while staying in a hotel. Once they got home, they would quietly ask the grocer to slip a roll or three into the grocery bag. Next time you're sitting on the porcelain thunder throne, look over at that roll of oh-so-nice paper and be glad the Scott brothers were so clever. Alcohol. People used it to alleviate stress and destroy lives. Some folks can drink it with no problems, and others it's their biggest problem. In AA, they say, first, the man takes a drink. Then, the drink takes a drink. Then, the drink takes the man. We all know what happened in 1776, but do you know what happened almost immediately afterwards? The whole revolution was supposed to be about England taxing the colonies. All that give me liberty and stuff. But did you know the first thing Congress did was enact a tax in order to pay for the revolution? The first tax in the United States was the alcohol tax. The farmers were making booze from their crops and hauling it into town in order to make money. Congress passed a tax that nearly led to another revolution. The farmers had to give the government some of their hard-earned profits so the guys in the Capitol could sit around and think up more ways to steal money from the citizens. For those of you that don't know, the opposite of progress is Congress. They seem intent on screwing up our country. Most of our problems today can be attributed directly to policies enacted by Congress in the past. A bunch of folks got the idea that they know so much more than those of us out here in the real world, so they feel duty-bound to make our lives better by passing laws that only make life worse. One of the biggest scams ever was Prohibition. 1919, Prohibition was ratified as the 18th Amendment to our Constitution. The idea was common folks were spending too much money on booze, and this was causing trouble at home. Crime and anger would magically go away if people stopped drinking the devil's brew. Those folks living large in Washington knew the amendment was coming. Some, if not all, of them laid in huge stockpiles of alcohol. The public heard Prohibition was coming, but there was nothing they could do. Congress does what Congress wants to do, and the rest of us just have to live with it. See, Prohibition didn't outlaw alcohol. It only made it illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell alcohol. If you had a cellar full of the stuff, that was perfectly legal. Congress expressly wrote the law so they wouldn't have to go without their relaxing drinks. 1919, when it became illegal to manufacture, transport, or sell any form of alcohol, the folks in Washington were drinking themselves into a stupor as they patted themselves on the back for doing away with crime and turmoil in the rest of the country. And with that sad note, we're going to take a break and play a few commercials, so don't go away. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Do you have skin? Would you like to take better care of it? Call Lourdes James, independent beauty consultant, and set up an appointment. Call 723-3019. Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Tribe. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle Del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. You're listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And welcome back to the show. We were just talking about that nasty, horrible con job called Prohibition. Some folks wanted a drink at the end of the day. Some folks wanted a few drinks at the end of the day. When there's a gap needed filling, there are folks who will fill that gap in a means of making a lot of money. Prohibition was the best thing to happen for organized crime. Before 1919, organized crime was mostly just a nuisance. They would operate in the back alleys and basements, smuggling and selling things, but all in all, society hardly even noticed them. Then, Congress passed Prohibition, which could also be called the Organized Crime Enhancement Act. Suddenly, organized crime kicked into high gear. They got busy manufacturing and importing cheap alcohol and selling it at a huge profit. Politicians were either handed bags full of cash or killed. You played ball with organized crime or you died. Some people wanted to drink and began experimenting on different substances you could consume, things like vanilla extract and shoe polish. Industrial alcohol was drinkable until the government passed regulations making the manufacturers have to add chemicals that were highly dangerous. People still drank it and promptly died. The government said, oh well, they shouldn't have drank the stuff and continued adding nasty chemicals to the mix. Folks like Al Capone and Legs Diamond were more popular with the citizens than any politicians in Washington. The politicians were the ones trying to stop folks from enjoying themselves. Organized crime were holding the parties, and they were doing some civic-minded activities that endeared them with the public. Most people don't know it, but Al Capone opened the first ever soup kitchen in Chicago to feed hungry citizens who couldn't afford to eat. He also killed a lot of people who tried to stop his crime empire. All Prohibition did was make organized crime stronger and the government bigger. It wasn't only big crime organizations that smuggled or manufactured booze. Go to any liquor store and look at the shelves. Somewhere on the shelf you'll see something called a hip flask. It's a curved bottle that looks as if it just might fit in a pocket. However, it doesn't really fit. It was never meant to go in your pocket. No, the hip flask was designed to fit in a boot. A person would walk across the border, either north or south, into Canada or Mexico, where alcohol was still legal. You could buy anything you wanted. The shape of the bottle was just perfect to fit in the top of a boot. Then the person would walk back into the United States with alcohol in their boots. This led to the term bootlegging. You just had to be sure the customs agents didn't ask you to pull up your pant legs or the hem of your dress. For 13 years, citizens supported organized crime, making it into a giant monster, while government officials and federal law enforcement did everything they could to alienate themselves from the citizens. The bizarre thing at the time was, say you wanted to use a substance to get high, but you weren't going to break the law, for whatever reason. Up until 1930, 3 years before Prohibition was rescinded, you could smoke marijuana and not break any laws. As long as you paid the marijuana tax, you were good to go. So if you drank beer, you were a criminal, but if you smoked a joint, you might just get a fine. My, how things have changed. The 18th Amendment was done away with in 1933 when the 21st Amendment came into being. The only outcome of the entire 13 years of legal morality was the change from organized crime from a tiny part of the country to a massive growth of the criminal organizations. Untold thousands of people were murdered by smugglers and illegal still owners. Now, what was that about making the country a better place by passing laws? And speaking of law, how about the way we enforce laws today? Ever wonder why and how this happened? Well, let's take a look. Way back in the early days, like the Roman Empire, laws were enforced by the army. The army would patrol the city under Roman rule and quickly take care of any problems. If you survived being taken into custody, you were taken before a magistrate for sentencing. The most often form of punishment was being killed. Then there was the possibility of being placed in irons, those are chains, and forced to work for the state. You might wind up working in a mine or rowing a warship. Either way, it was long hours and hard work, and chances were you probably wouldn't survive. When the Roman Empire began its slow decline, the job of protecting a community fell to the folks living there. You were expected to pitch in and help protect your neighbors. The men would wait until some crime was committed, and then they'd go looking for the perpetrator. If someone was found, usually there'd be a quick execution. There was no reason to arrest a crook because there was no one to drag them before. A system called frank pledge, or peace pledge, came about in the earliest days of Europe, around 300 or 400 AD. The community would establish a group of men, anyone over 12 years old, and they would go out patrolling their land and the lands of their neighbors. The men all swore an oath to bring to justice anybody, including their neighbors, that they caught committing a crime. This wasn't a volunteer thing. You were expected to join in any time you were called. A group of 10 men was called a tithing. 10 tithings were grouped together to form 100, and were placed under the supervision of a constable. The title constable comes from the Latin, which is stabuli, or attendant of the stables. Literally, this meant the count of the stable. This originated in the Roman Empire. The constable was the officer responsible for keeping the horses of the lord or the monarch. Under the Frank Pledge, the constable was given the authority to enforce laws in the community. He would be placed over 10 tithings or 100 men. As with any system that had little oversight, the Frank Pledge began to break down. The men would use their authority to gain financially or get even with anyone whom they had a grudge with. The idea of only using constables soon took in its place. The constables would arrest suspicious-looking folks and drag them before the king. In the 1300s, the king began to appoint men to take care of all the niggly little decisions the royals didn't want to have to deal with. This led to the creation of justices of the peace. Now the constables could take any small cases before the justices instead of bothering the king with them. As more and more people began living in the cities, the need for a full-time professional policing system began to appear. In England, a minister of Parliament named Sir Robert Peel, keep that name in mind, began to advocate for the creation... Thank you. My cat just knocked something off my desk. Sir Robert Peel, keep that name in mind, began to advocate for the creation of a metropolitan police force. He eventually was successful in creating the Metropolitan Police Service in London. People living in London began to refer to the police as Peelers. After a few years, some folks began to call them Bobbies as an abbreviation of Robert. Now you know why they call them Bobbies in England. A lot of the residents in London were afraid of the police, thinking that they would be just another form of military. So Peel took some steps to differentiate his men from the army. The police wore blue uniforms as a contrast to the bright red uniforms of the Royal Armed Forces. They were also forbidden to carry guns, and at all times the importance of maintaining the public's trust was impressed upon members of the force. Unfortunately, and I've lost my place. Unfortunately, the entry-level job in the police was minimum wage. You didn't attract the best men by paying them the lowest wages, so there were some police officers who should have been doing other things. The Metropolitan Police Service is responsible for law enforcement within Greater London, which excludes the square mile of the City of London, which is covered by the City of London Police. The Bobbies were stationed in an old private house at number 4 Whitehall Place. The rear of the structure opened into Greater Scotland Yard, an open area used for horses. The Metropolitan Police Force headquarters was soon called Scotland Yard. Men dressed in uniform walking along the streets are pretty easy to spot. Criminals would see the Bobbies before the police knew there were criminals in the area. 1842, in a move to do something about this, the police began using plainclothes men as well. The citizenry accused the police of using spies in order to keep an eye on them. It took a lot of solved crimes before folks began to acknowledge the benefits of plainclothes policemen. Detectives were all associated with the buildings out back, known as Scotland Yard. By 1878, Scotland Yard had established their first Criminal Investigations Division, or CID. Their job was to gather information on criminal activity in the city. Dealing with criminals, and sometimes people they thought were criminals, the police all over the world used some harsh methods to extract confessions. The suspects were considered guilty and treated accordingly. The third degree is a euphemism for torture, by inflicting pain, physical or mental, to extract a confession or statement. Where the term third degree came from, nobody knows. It caught on, but nobody bothered to write down who or why. 1931, the Wickersham Commission found that the use of the third degree was widespread in the United States. The use of the third degree was technically made illegal by the Wickersham Report. This brings to mind a saying by Nietzsche: "If you stare into the abyss stares into you." In English, this means if you deal with criminals all the time, you begin to think everyone is a criminal. That's why a lot of police officers seem a bit harsh when you deal with them as civilians. The side effect of joining any law enforcement agency is not so good. You begin to think everybody's a crook. You don't like talking to those outsiders. Divorce is between 70 and 80%. Most of the guys I worked with had been divorced, some more than once. Anarchists want to do away with all authority. Just think how much fun that would be. If your neighbor wanted to take your car, your only recourse would be to draw your gun and hope you were faster than him. Once again, I'd like to invite you to be sure and stop by the Book Warehouse, 1600 Water Street, here in Laredo, October 28th at 5 p.m. We'll be having a book signing as well as a meet and greet. Hopefully, some of the guys from the Laredo Paranormal Research Society will be there with me. I'll be signing copies of the LPRS book. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends. Invite people to listen in so we can expand our listeners. If you have something in mind you'd like to hear us talk about, send us a message at strangethings.arkanasa.com. Oh, correction, that's strangethings@arkanasa.com.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, they say murder 3? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?